Detailed geometric models are often represented as dense triangle meshes. Unfortunately, the huge size and irregularity of such meshes present challenges in manipulation, animation, rendering, transmission, and storage. In this work, we introduce a new surface representation, the displaced subdivision surface. We describe a simple automatic scheme for converting detailed models into such a representation. This video will also provide some animations, review compression results, and discuss rendering issues and opportunities. A displaced subdivision surface represents a detailed model using a subdivision-based, scalar-valued displacement over a smooth subdivision surface. Thus, both the domain surface and the displacement field are unified around loop subdivision. The representation is equally well posed for Catmull-Clark subdivision. To convert a dense triangle mesh into a displaced subdivision surface, the mesh is first simplified using a traditional sequence of edge collapses, augmented with the constraint that the resulting subdivision surface be able to describe the original surface as its offset. The resulting control mesh defines a smooth domain surface. We next optimize the control mesh vertices to make the domain surface more closely match the original. The result is a smooth version of the original model where those features that may be represented as an offset have been removed. The next step of the process uses ray casting to determine the offset of the original model from each domain patch. Each domain patch is sampled on a uniform grid. The product of this process is a loop subdivision surface that describes the domain surface, with a piecewise regular scalar loop subdivision field representing the model detail. One alternative to using subdivision surfaces as the domain surface is to directly use the triangular facets of a simplified model. In this case, the displacements are calculated using normals interpolated across the planar facet of the domain mesh. As we see in this example, the representation does not behave well during animation. Animation of displaced subdivision surfaces is accomplished by manipulating the control mesh. In these sequences, bones were placed in the control meshes and used to animate the characters. While the animations are admittedly crude, they illustrate the smooth and predictable deformation of the displaced subdivision surface. Another strength of displaced subdivision surfaces is the ease with which they are compressed. Displaced subdivision surfaces allow fine detail to be compressed as a scalar-valued function. In these examples, we see the original uncompressed mesh compared with the compressed displaced subdivision surface. In this final segment, we provide two examples of the scalable rendering of displaced subdivision surfaces. In the first sequence, the fidelity of the tessellation is controlled by bounding the approximation error. In the last sequence, we demonstrate the usefulness of bump maps computed as one representation of a model. Tangent space bump maps are easily computed from displaced subdivision surfaces. In this video, we have presented displaced subdivision surfaces. We described a simple construction and reviewed some of their salient features. These features include their compactness, their ease of animation, and their inherently scalable nature.
Environment matting, introduced at SIGGRAPH 99, is a technique for capturing mats of objects by photographing them in front of structured backdrops. In this paper, we discuss two extensions to that work, one for increasing the accuracy and realism of the composite images, and another for increasing the efficiency of capturing the mats. The original environment matting technique produced reasonably good results requiring a number of photographs logarithmic in the size of the image. Our first technique will aim to increase the quality of the reconstructed images at the expense of taking additional photographs of the object. We photograph the object in front of a single stripe of Gaussian cross-section in varying positions and orientations. Due to the number of images required, we use a video camera to capture the data and pull individual frames from the video stream. Because the monitor and camera are not synchronized, the images are not captured at video rates. Here is the captured video shown sped up. You can see how the faceted glass ball acts as a prism, spreading the white light from the backdrop into different colors. Using our visualization tool, we can examine the responses recorded at each pixel. First, we can see the foreground color F and aggregate attenuation coefficient R. We extracted these parameters after imaging the object against two solid backdrops. Next, we load a background image B and composite the object over this image using the full environment map. After selecting a pixel on the composite, we see a series of Gaussian functions in the surrounding windows. The upper left window shows the response for a stripe in the horizontal direction. The right half of that window shows the data over all time steps. The left half is an enlarged view. The points are RGB values for each stripe position, and the curves were fitted by estimating the y-coordinates of the width and center of the pixel's weighting functions, one function per color channel. The other windows show similar responses for the vertical and two diagonal stripe sweeps. The lines drawn in the background image are aligned with the sweep directions and positioned according to the calculated centers. They intersect at the estimated RGB centers of the weighting functions. As we select another pixel, we see the effects of dispersion. The centers of the weighting function are different for each channel, resulting in a prismatic color spread. In another pixel, we see the effects of multiple mappings to the background, which occur at pixels that straddle facets of this crystal object. After estimating multiple Gaussians for each stripe pass, we can determine the correct set of mappings to the background. We can also visualize the effects of oriented mappings onto the backdrop. For this tilted pie-tin, we can see the widths and orientation of the major and minor axes drawn as rotated crosshairs in the background image. Since our model can have a single pixel see different regions of the background for each color channel, the prismatic effects of light passing through the ball are accurately recreated. Here's a comparison of the environment mat to an actual photograph. Two areas of the background are visible on the sides of this glass, a refraction through the surface and a reflection off it. The previous work assumes a single rectangle as the background footprint, and so is unable to capture this bimodal distribution. Our multimodal model captures this effect successfully. Here's the environment mat versus a photo. This object highlights the advantage of using Gaussian weighting functions captured with Gaussian stripes, rather than rectangular weighting functions captured with square wave stripes. The reflections off this tilted glossy surface have blocky artifacts with the old technique, but are smooth with the Gaussian model. The photograph shows the reflections off the surface should be smooth. Here we see the impact of estimating orientation of the Gaussians, rather than assuming they are axis aligned. On the right, we employ our unoriented Gaussian model. Note how the strongly directional background pattern is blurred out on the pie-tin. On the left, we have estimated the orientations of the Gaussian, and the directional pattern is more clearly preserved in the reflection. While this more complex model is able to more accurately recreate physical effects, the number of images of the object required might be prohibitive in some situations. An alternative way to improve on the original method would be to require fewer images. We're going to make the strongest restriction possible. We'll attempt to capture an environment mat from a single photograph of the object. While this necessitates significant restrictions on the model, as described in the paper, with a single photograph solution we can do something we can't do with even a two-photograph solution. Capture an environment mat movie for moving, non-rigid objects by constructing a mat for each frame. The basic technique requires that the object be lit only by the backdrop, with no light contributed by other parts of the environment. The structured background is a smooth color wash. By examining the color seen at a pixel, we can determine what area of the backdrop is seen and how much the light is attenuated. With the specular highlight estimation described in the paper, we can capture a glass filmed with a light source. On the left is a glass fish sculpture on a rotating platform, captured with the video mat technique and composited over the fruit image. On the right, we're showing video of the fish rotating in front of the fruit image displayed on the backdrop monitor. The comparison is not frame accurate, of course, but we can see that the video environment mat does a reasonable job of capturing the fish's refraction pattern. The curved surface of the fish is even more apparent when the highlights are modeled. Here we show a flask of glycerin in which we are blowing bubbles through a plastic tube. Though there is considerable noise in the neck of the flask, the refractions through the bubbles are recreated effectively. This effect is greatly enhanced by the addition of highlights.
We first use a light stage to illuminate a subject from all possible directions. The subject's appearance is then recorded with video cameras. Each camera thus yields a four-dimensional slice of the subject's eight-dimensional reflectance field, comprised of the two-dimensional images of the face captured under a two-dimensional set of lighting directions. Here we see a downsampled representation of this four-dimensional dataset for one of the cameras. To generate an image of the face illuminated by a captured lighting environment, we resample the lighting into the same set of directions and scale each image of the face by the color and intensity of the environment in the corresponding direction. Adding these scaled images together then generates an image of the face under the sampled illumination. We would like to be able to render the face from arbitrary viewpoints as well as under arbitrary illumination. Using the light field technique, a two-dimensional array of cameras would allow this to be done directly from captured data. In this work, we capture data from only two cameras and use a range scan of the face and a reflectance analysis technique to synthesize the face from novel viewpoints. The reflectance analysis is performed on a transposed version of the captured dataset. If we consider a single pixel of the face across all of the captured lighting directions, we can construct a new image we call a reflectance function. Here we see a mosaic of these reflectance functions containing 1/32 of the total dataset. Each reflectance function encodes how the face scatters each direction of incident illumination toward a particular viewpoint, and includes all the effects of shadowing, mutual illumination, and subsurface scattering. To transform the reflectance function to a novel viewpoint, we first separate the function into its specular and subsurface components using a color space technique. We then modulate the subsurface component based on its observed chromaticity falloff, and warp and scale the specular component using a generalized Torrance-Sparrow model. Adding these transformed components together yields the reflectance function resynthesized for the novel viewpoint. To render the illuminated reflectance functions at the correct positions from novel viewpoints, we recover a geometric model of the face using structured lighting. The normals of the model are noisy, so we instead use surface normals computed from the reflectance data. We then render views that are geometrically from the original camera viewpoints, but with the pixels shaded according to the novel viewpoint. Lastly, we project these renderings onto the geometry, thus placing the correctly shaded pixels in the correct positions and producing the final render. For each of the lighting environment examples, we first show the complete rendering and then show the resynthesized specular component alone. In these examples, the illumination environment remains fixed while the face nods from left to right.
Post-space deformation allows an animator to move an articulated or parameterized model into any position in the parameter space, resculpt the skin surface, and save the pose containing the deformed skin. After all poses are saved,
post-space deformation will smoothly interpolate the desired deformations. To show how the algorithm works on the oft-troublesome shoulder area, we begin with a human arm in the neutral position. This is our first pose. Next, we move the arm into an extreme pose. With only conventional skeleton-weighted deformation, the shoulder collapses. Now, we resculpt the surface to get a more realistic appearance and save the pose. In this articulated figure, the concatenated degrees of freedom of relevant joints define the pose space. When each deformed pose is saved, the rotation values for relevant joints identify the location of that deformation in the pose space. The relevant joints are those that have moved with respect to the rest position. Once we have several poses, the pose-space deformation algorithm calculates a smoothly interpolating deformation for each new position between our first pose and the extreme pose. We must fine-tune a sigma value to determine the extent and fall-off of a particular pose in the pose space. Here's the final rendered animation, which was created using only the two poses you've just seen. Here's another example with skeleton-weighted deformation and pose-space deformation using only two poses. Another skeleton-weighted deformation and pose-space deformation. We added a third pose here, at the point where the skin on the inside of the elbow comes in contact with itself and starts to compress. We can continue to resculpt and add new poses in order to have the model deform realistically in any desired position.
First, we show a clip of an actual actor performing a line from Shakespeare.
Love me. Why must be requited?
To generate an animation of this performance, we first define the basic upper body movement of our actor as a sequence of key points. This animation shows a simple linear interpolation between these key points with no effort or shape settings. Now, we show the animation with the effort and shape parameters set to mimic our actor. The effort and shape parameters can be changed interactively, and the animations are generated in real time. Using the 4 effort motion factors, space, weight, time, and flow, we can easily phrase expressive changes. The graph on the left shows the effort changes for the given animation. When we show the animation again, note the differences in the dynamic qualities of the movements. The actor makes 3 opening gestures. The first 2 are bound and quick, while the third is free, quick, and strong. This is followed by a free and quick lifting of the arms, ending in a strong, bound, quick, and direct, emphatic end. For this animation, we reverse the original effort settings. Instead of using sudden, strong, and bound qualities, we make the movements considerably more light and slightly more free and sustained. Note how we get a dramatically different animation. The shape parameters affect both the torso and limbs along the body axes, vertical, horizontal, and sagittal. In the next series of animations, we show how shape affects the limbs. Starting with the original effort and shape settings, we adjust just one limb shape specification in a single dimension, getting significant variations in the movement. Here we set the upper key points to show more rising and the lower key points to show more sinking. This animation reverses the previous settings so that the upper key points show more sinking and the lower key points show more rising. This results in movements within a smaller range, where the actor is more confined in an up and down manner. This animation uses settings where the horizontal limb parameter is set to be more enclosing, resulting in more confined inward movements. The torso plays an important role in lifelike animated movements. Here we keep the original effort and shape settings for the limbs, but remove all shape specification for the torso. Note how the movement loses its conviction and naturalness. The dynamic qualities of a movement play an important role in the meaning conveyed. Here our subject uses American Sign Language to make the statement, "I was sick, but now I am well." This animation mimics our subject. The first phrase shows sinking and retreating qualities, and the second phrase displays rising and advancing qualities. In the following animation, we reverse the effort and shape settings. Notice how these changes seem to change the meaning of the movements. Emote provides an animator with new tools to explore expressive movement animation. Emote also offers a simple parametric movement vocabulary grounded in Laban movement analysis for computer-synthesized gesture.
Style machines are probabilistic models that can generate animation data in a broad variety of styles. Style machines are learned from data. Instead of learning a single model of the data, we learn a low-dimensional manifold of models that spans all the stylistic variations in the data. Each point on the manifold indexes a unique model. Every model captures a different style. The dimensionality and coordinate system of the style manifold are determined automatically. In this video, we show animations generated from a style manifold of path maps. A path map is a probabilistic model that infers the behavior of a target system X from observations of a Q system Y. The mapping may be very ambiguous. For example, path maps have been used to infer facial motion from voice data and full 3D body motion from shadows. A path map interprets the behavior of a Q system in terms of qualitative states of the target system. Every possible state sequence is assigned a probability according to its global consistency with the entire Q time series and with the qualitative dynamics of the target system. From this distribution over state sequences, we can synthesize an optimal target time series. Here, we will use a learned style manifold of path maps to synthesize virtual motion capture. By sampling path maps at different coordinates on the style manifold, we can resynthesize motion data in a variety of styles. The outputs are sequences of raw marker positions, which we have rendered as skeletons. However, the bones are purely decorative and have no algorithmic content. We begin with some style analogies. For example, walking is to running as strutting is to what? We solve these analogies by completing the parallelogram on our learned style manifold. Here are the three given corners: walking, strutting, and running, which the style machine resynthesizes as a strutting run that looks like high-speed skanking, a dance form. Here's another analogy with walking, the catwalk of a fashion model, and running, which is then resynthesized as cat running. Of course, walk cycles and motion primitives are relatively easy. Let's consider resynthesizing entire performances. Here is a valiant attempt at ballet by a graduate student. After stumbling, losing the beat, and missing moves, he decides to keep his day job. We'll resynthesize this data with a style machine that has been trained on some highly skilled performances in a variety of ballet and modern dance styles. Here are relevant snippets from two of the training sequences. The choreography is similar, but the motions are quite different. The learning algorithm discovers their correspondence. Here is our novice's performance, resynthesized in an artificial style that lies near those of the two skilled performances just shown. Shorebeat's taking lessons. Style machines can be driven by data other than motion capture. Here we show some animation generated from a sequence of shadows. Here is the sequence of silhouettes, computed from video using simple vision algorithms such as back subtraction. Here is an initial 3D reconstruction. Here is a more stylized balletic version of the jump, and this was synthesized from style coordinates taken closer to that of modern dance. A style machine can generate new, plausible choreography by doing random walks on its internal state machine. Essentially, it's being driven by noise. Here's some random choreography synthesized in a style near our ballet sample, but far from our lazy ballet sample. Here's the same choreography synthesized in a more modern style, but slightly lazier and with more mannish body dynamics.
Time warp rigid body simulation is useful for computing the motion of systems with hundreds or more independently moving bodies. The key idea is to simulate the bodies asynchronously, so that the numerical integration of a particular body's state is halted only for events such as collisions that can influence that body's motion. Stopping integration only for relevant events facilitates larger average integration steps and faster simulation. The cars in this simulation are multi-bodies, collections of rigid bodies linked together by joints. These are dynamically coupled and cannot be integrated separately. Rather, the multi-body components are advanced and rolled back as a unit, like runners in a three-legged race. This coupling reduces the benefit of the time warp algorithm, but with enough independent subsystems, the algorithm still offers a speed advantage. Usually, multi-body couplings are static, meaning that joints are not broken or added during a simulation. Then it is straightforward to accommodate them in the time warp framework. In this example, the robot's motions are not scripted but generated by motion planners that translate high-level goals into joint torques. Accurately predicting when collisions or contact changes will occur is difficult. Rather than use a conservative strategy, which can be inefficient, the time warp algorithm may make fairly aggressive assumptions that bodies will not interact in the near future. When such an assumption proves false, the system detects the exception and recovers through a process called rollback. This entails backing up only the bodies that are influenced by the unpredicted event and only to the point in time when the influence begins. In other words, the time warp algorithm is stingy about backing up bodies and does so to the minimum extent necessary to ensure correctness. In this final example, the 300 initially separated rocks form contact groups as they tumble down the terrain. Groups connected by chains of contact are dynamically coupled, and unlike multi-body couplings, group couplings are created and destroyed during the simulation. With some added bookkeeping, the time warp algorithm can accommodate such groups and still take advantage of dynamic independence whenever possible. The preceding 3 simulations were all computed in less than 1 second per frame, using a single processor of an SGI Onyx. This avalanche simulation took much longer because of the time needed to solve very large contact force problems. More complete quantitative data for all of the simulations may be found in the accompanying paper. In all cases, the time warp algorithm greatly improves the efficiency of the simulations. It also helps pave the way to parallel or distributed simulation of large rigid body systems.
This video presents animations generated using the Markov chain Monte Carlo or MCMC algorithm for sampling plausible solutions to multi-body constraint problems. As our first example, we present a physically simplified 2D ball bouncing such that it lands near a specific point, indicated by the green target. We will show 5 samples. The surface normal at each collision point is allowed to vary, as indicated by the red arrows. We associate a probability density function with this scenario that defines normals near vertical as more likely than others. To enforce the constraint, we modify the distribution to assign higher probability to sets of normals that cause the ball to land near the target. The MCMC algorithm then generates an arbitrary number of samples according to the desired distribution, 5 of which we chose at random to present here. Note that the ball doesn't always land exactly on the target. Such unacceptable animations could be filtered out if the user so desired. This set of examples shows constrained 10-pin bowling shots. First we show 3 very different strikes, coming from different parts of the lane and with different speeds. We did not explicitly request any particular style of strike. Our algorithm explores the space of possibilities without user intervention. Next we show a set of 4 rounds, in which the first shot sets up a 6-7 split and the second shot bowls the spare. The setup shot is hard to bowl because it is difficult to knock down the lower left pins while leaving the 6th pin in place. The spares do not show much variation. There are not many ways to bowl such a shot. The bowling model allows for variation in the size and mass of the ball, its release point, and its release linear and angular velocities. The position of each pin is also allowed to vary slightly. The user specifies which pins are standing at the start of the simulation and which should remain standing at the end, so we can specify any bowling shot. The MCMC algorithm generates a sequence of animations from which we chose these samples, in which the desired outcome is more likely to appear than any other. This model uses an impulse-based simulator, which is adequate for capturing the behaviors shown, but lacking the quality friction model required to knock down a 7-10 split. Our model will not produce animations that the simulator says will never happen, which is essential for ensuring that only plausible simulations are generated. The strikes came from a single MCMC chain, the splits from another, and the spares from a third. Each chain ran for a few hours on a 200 MHz PC and produced hundreds of examples of each shot, although fewer of the split setup shot because of the constraints are difficult to satisfy. Finally, we show a slow-motion replay of 2 setup shots. Note that while the initial conditions look similar, the outcomes are very different. This chaotic behavior makes multi-body constraint problems difficult to solve, because a small change in the simulation parameters can cause major, discontinuous changes in the quality of the outcome with respect to the constraints. Now we show marbles that spell words. The marbles move quickly because they are small, dense, and hard. Each falls from a random location above the partitioned box, in this case spelling high. The partition shape is allowed to vary slightly, too little to be perceived in this rendering. All these examples were hand-chosen from a single chain that produced around 100 good animations in a 5-hour run of 10,000 iterations on a 200 MHz PC. This slow-motion replay highlights the differences between the solutions. Remember, each comes from the same run of the algorithm, and all the variation arises from randomness in the scenario, not from any explicit user intervention. In this bigger example, 30 balls fall into 105 bins. These solutions were hand-chosen from a chain that produced several hundred examples in 200,000 iterations, taking 7 days to compute on a PC. The longer computation time is due to the greater number of balls, because each simulation takes longer and the constraints are much harder to satisfy. We close with a new rendition of this year's SIGGRAPH logo.
well as the supporting lines used to projection of the occludee is completely projection of the occludee. Note that the action occluding points indicates the line from which it is taken. Its projection indicates removal of the first occluder. The same occluder is tested. Its projection is the following division of the two occluders. It is thus declared hidden. Note that the occluder points into the spot from which it is visible. Hence, the second occluder alone will also not have occluded the occludee. Occluder fusion has been correctly handled. For a scene and occlusion sweep, we apply the occlusion sweep sweeping process. The visual first is both shown in the set. This is just post-process sweeping. The actual sweep takes 10 to 2 seconds when reduced using
Compressing the connectivity of triangular meshes has recently been the subject of intense study, and compact representations have been proposed. Many polygonal models, such as this Triceratops mesh, are initially not triangulated. In fact, standard meshes contain a surprisingly small number of triangles, here shown in red. The dominating mesh element is a quadrangle, or quadrilateral. But pentagons, hexagons, and higher degree faces are also common. This is the case for a number of well-known meshes in computer graphics, such as the Gallian model, the Cessna model, the Beethoven bust, the Sandal, and others. The entire model collection from Viewpoint Data Labs contains meshes with a low triangle count. There are several reasons not to triangulate a mesh before compressing it. Triangulating a model prior to compression not only modifies the original data, typically it doubles the number of faces and increases the number of corners by 50%. These mesh features often have normals, colors, and other associated properties. These properties need to be replicated, which makes encoding them significantly more expensive. Many polygon meshes also contain structural information that classifies groups of faces into logical units. Such structures establish a mapping between meaningful parts of a real-world object and the faces in the model that represent it. The meat cuts on the cow model and the classification on the teapot model were created by us. But here are the color-coded group structures as they are present in our example meshes. Often this information is used to attach material properties to groups of faces. Encoding such structures on a model has not been addressed by any previously reported compression scheme. For models that are composed of several unconnected mesh components, such as the sails of this galleon, the group structure is partially captured through the component structure. But whenever the faces of a single component belong to more than one group, such as in the body of the galleon, there is structural information that needs to be captured in some other way. Face Fixer is the first compression scheme that is designed to encode polygon meshes in their native polygonal representation. Previous approaches to reconstruct the original polygon information compress a triangulated version of the input and then mark the set of edges that needs to be removed to recover the polygons. Finally, an example run that illustrates how Face Fixer encodes the connectivity of a polygon mesh. The algorithm starts with a boundary that is initially defined around an arbitrary mesh edge. An active gate is a distinguished edge on the boundary at which the boundary is updated. If the active gate is adjacent to an unprocessed face, the boundary is extended around this face. Otherwise, the active gate is adjacent to another boundary edge, with which it is fixed together. This can split the boundary into two loops, which are then processed one after the other. A stack is used to temporarily buffer boundaries. Each of the possible boundary updates is encoded with a different label, which makes the entire process invertible. The number of labels equals the number of edges in the mesh. A superface, which is used to encode group structures in the mesh, is processed like a large face. After including a superface into the boundary, its interior is first encoded in its entirety before the algorithm continues on the remaining mesh. The sequence of labels can then be encoded by minimum entropy encoding, such as arithmetic encoding.
This video illustrates our work on applying surface light fields to 3D photography. A surface light field associates a color with every ray originating on a surface. The radiance leaving a point on the surface may vary with direction. Therefore, we represent all radiance leaving a point with a function from direction to color, which we call a lumosphere. By assigning a lumosphere to every point on a surface light field completely encodes all of the radiance leaving the surface. By rendering the surface light field representation, we can reproduce the complex effects governing the appearance of real objects. This surface light field, captured from a shiny ceramic fish, reproduces the detailed texture and specularity of the original object. You can even see global effects such as the reflection of the fish's tail in its side. Here we see a surface light field of another object, a marble elephant. The interactive viewer employs a rendering algorithm capable of interactive frame rates on PC-class hardware, even in the absence of 3D acceleration. To construct a surface light field, we begin with scan geometry and a set of photographs from different camera positions. We then estimate a surface light field function that reproduces the input data. We have developed 3 different estimation algorithms which differ in the size of the resulting representation and the method by which holes in the input data are filled. The first method, a simple resampling with pointwise fairing to fill holes, produces high-fidelity reproductions. However, it also results in very large file sizes. The other estimation methods produce highly compressed data with little loss of quality. One compression method is function quantization, a novel variation on vector quantization. The other compression algorithm, principal function analysis, is a variation on principal component analysis. Function quantization achieves higher fidelity to the input, but principal function analysis produces smoother results. The interactive renderer can render surface light fields directly from either of these compressed representations. Here we compare a surface light field with a similar representation, a geometry-corrected lumograph constructed from the same input data. We then compressed both data sets, the surface light field using principal function analysis and the lumograph using the vector quantization method of Lavoie and Hanrahan. Note that the compressed surface light field exhibits fewer artifacts despite having been compressed further. To improve rendering performance, we developed a view-dependent level of detail algorithm. It maintains a screen space error tolerance and in addition coarsen parts of the mesh that lie outside the view frustum or in back-facing areas. Unlike previous methods, our algorithm operates on triangle meshes with subdivision connectivity and is thus well suited for textured surfaces. The properties of our surface light field representation enable some interesting editing operations. We can simulate changes in the specular properties of a surface by applying a filter to the light field function. Here we are making the elephant's surface shinier. Here we simulate rotating the environment around the elephant. Even though we never captured images with the changed environment, we can achieve plausible results by applying a simple transformation to the surface light field function. Here we have modified the geometry of the fish using a volumetric deformation. Note that the specular highlights have shifted positions plausibly.
This research extends the light field and lumograph image-based rendering methods and enhances their utility, especially in scenes with significant depth variation. Light fields and lumographs use a large database of images, as shown on the left, to efficiently create novel scenes, as shown on the right. We have added the ability to vary the apparent focus within a light field using intuitive camera-like controls similar to a variable aperture and focus ring. We can vary the effective depth of field by changing the size of our camera surface aperture. By increasing the size of our aperture, we increase the number of samples used when reconstructing a ray. In practice, we can improve the frequency response of our reconstruction by weighting the rays unequally. We can also affect the reconstruction by moving the focal surface. By moving the focal surface, we dynamically change which samples in the data cameras are used for reconstruction. This has the effect of changing what appears in focus. Together with the variable aperture control, we can create interesting photographic effects. This runs at interactive rates using our renderer on consumer-grade PC graphics cards. The resolution is 512 by 384. This parameterization works independently of scene geometry. We do not need to recover actual or approximate geometry of the scene for focusing. The focal plane can also be used as a user interface aid. Although we have no approximate geometry, we know that the focal plane passes through an object when that object is in focus. This lets us rotate about objects in a light field. In addition, we present a method for direct auto-stereoscopic viewing of light fields using a reparameterized light field image and a $30 hexagonal lens array. Using further reparameterizations, we can create auto-stereoscopic images based on the principles of integral and lenticular photography. This gives us a passive auto-stereoscopic display that can be used by multiple viewers at the same time with no eye tracking. In conclusion, we reparameterize the light field in LumaGraph for a more flexible rendering system. Dynamically reparameterized light fields give the user greater artistic control, are simple to capture, and are efficient to render.
The analysis of planoptic sampling here is based on a spectral analysis of the two-dimensional light field or LumaGraph. Let's first take a look at a simple scene with a constant depth plane. Its spectral support is a line passing through the origin in the frequency domain. Adding another constant depth plane corresponds to having a new line in the frequency domain. The spectrum support of the light field signal changes as we introduce more depth variation. However, the spectral support is still bounded by the two lines in the frequency domain, which is determined by the minimum and maximum depth respectively. Sampling along the t direction results in replicas of the spectral support. The closer the camera is spaced, the larger the interval. In order to reduce the samples needed in the light field rendering, we must reduce the interval in the frequency domain. If no depth information is available, oversampling is the only way for anti-aliased light field rendering. To reduce samples, we can apply a reconstruction filter using a constant depth. In particular, the minimum sampling rate for light field rendering is achieved if we can design an optimal filter. The optimal filter is determined by the minimum and maximum depth of the scene. If we have more information about the scene geometry, we can further reduce the image samples with multiple depth layers. Given rendering resolution, the relationship between the number of the images and scene geometry can be described quantitatively by a minimum sampling curve in joint image and geometry space. Image rendered at any points along and above the curve have the same quality. Therefore, any points above the curve are redundant. As we change the rendering resolution, the curve changes as well. Given 2x2 images, our model indicates 12 layers of depth are needed for this face. Notice the aliasing when the number of the depth layers is below 12. Given 3 layers of depth, 8x8 images must be used according to our model. The relationship between the number of images and the depth uncertainty can also be described in our model. Given a depth error bound, we can keep the number of samples to the minimum. According to our model, 124 by 124 images are needed for this scene with large depth variation. Conventional light field rendering with 48 by 48 images is shown on the left. Visual artifacts are clearly visible, as shown on the right, using 16 by 16 images with only 3 bits depth information are sufficient.
Geometric complexity often proves a bottleneck when rendering complex meshes. As an example, this mesh has over 60,000 triangle faces. One technique for speeding up rendering is to simplify the mesh, but significant visual detail can be lost during simplification. Although much of the detail can be recovered in the form of a bump map, the coarse geometry is betrayed by the polygonal silhouette. In our approach, we construct a simplified mesh that is guaranteed to enclose the original mesh, and at runtime we extract the silhouette of the original mesh and use it to clip the coarse geometry. This method also allows us to efficiently anti-alias the object's silhouette, a feature previously available only on high-end graphic systems with supersampling. Here we toggle silhouette clipping on a 500 face coarse hole on the left and compare with the 69,000 face original mesh on the right. This video highlights the contributions of our paper. Progressive holes allows us to construct a coarse mesh with the proper nesting property. Progressive holes define a sequence of meshes where coarse ones completely enclose finer ones. In this work, we make use of progressive outer holes. But as shown here, the same construction can also be used to form progressive inner holes. In this paper, we present an efficient scheme for extracting the 3D silhouette contour of a model. Our algorithm, described in the paper, builds a hierarchy of culling anchored cone primitives. With this hierarchy, we only need to test a small fraction of the model edges for silhouette hood. In red, we show the extracted silhouette edges of the rotating object. In blue, we also show the additional edges that were tested for silhouette hood. To get a better look, we freeze the silhouette contour and visualize it from another point of view. Even on this more complicated example, we can extract the roughly 15,000 silhouette edges from the original 600,000 in about 20 milliseconds. The edges obtained from silhouette extraction are used to draw fan of faces into the stencil buffer, accumulating +1 values for front faces and -1 values for back faces. Shades of red represent negative stencil values, while shades of green represent positive ones. In the resulting stencil buffer, the stencil value at a pixel is positive if and only if it lies within the external silhouette of the object. The coarse geometry is then rendered subject to the stencil buffer. Another advantage of silhouette clipping is that anti-aliasing of the silhouette can be obtained with little extra cost. Here we compare the original high-resolution mesh with an anti-alias silhouette-clipped bump map model. The jagglies have mostly disappeared, although the video JPEG artifacts are still present. Our last contribution is an improved scheme for constructing texture parameterization over the coarse mesh. We first implemented the closest point parameterization scheme of Signoni et al. However, we found significant artifacts near concave regions. Our improvement is to sample texture values by shooting a ray along the interpolated surface normal of the coarse hull. This new parameterization is generally smooth, thereby eliminating most texture artifacts. This video has been recorded in real time on a PC with a 550 MHz Pentium 3 processor and a $200 GeForce graphics card.
This project is motivated by the desire to render complex three-dimensional objects as efficiently as possible. The fundamental approach of this research is to use surfals, or surface elements, as an alternative display primitive. Objects are represented as a dense set of surface point samples. Surfal objects offer complex shape, low rendering cost, and high image quality. During rendering, a hierarchical forward warping algorithm projects surfals to the screen. High image resolution and magnification may lead to undersampling or holes in the image. A novel method called visibility splatting allows us to detect these holes, shown in green in this animation. Applying a 2D filter, we are able to fill these holes and reconstruct the final image. For each surfal, we store several pre-filtered texture colors, similar to a conventional texture MIP map. This allows us to achieve high-quality texture filtering during rendering, as shown in this animation. In the next animation, we visualize the texture levels used for rendering with different colors. Note that we used linear interpolation to blend between different texture levels. The rendering pipeline hierarchically projects blocks of surfals. Blocks with different levels of detail are shown with different colors in this sequence. These scenes were recorded live on an 866 MHz Pentium 3 PC. Our surfal rendering pipeline is implemented fully in software. We can also project multiple circles per pixel for supersampling, trading off rendering speed for image quality. Circle objects can easily be integrated with traditional polygon graphics, as shown in this example. They are specifically suited for real-time graphics, such as games.
On an SGI Onyx 2 with infinite reality graphics, displaying a 130 million sample model of Michelangelo's St. Matthew. Note that it starts almost immediately. When the program starts, it reads in only coarse resolution data from disk and draws a rough version of the model. As more data is read in from disk, the model refines to a higher quality version. As we zoom in on a small section of the model, high-resolution data from this region is read in and displayed. QSplat uses a multi-resolution representation of geometry to perform level of detail control and visibility culling. The amount of data rendered at each frame is controlled to maintain a constant user-selectable frame rate. When the user stops moving the mouse, the model progressively refines to a high-quality version. This model of Michelangelo's St. Matthew contains 130 million range samples, uses 760 megabytes of space, and required 1 hour of pre-processing time. Because the algorithms and data structures used by QSplat are time and space efficient, it remains quite usable on low-end machines. As an extreme example, here we show QSplat running on a laptop with no 3D graphics hardware. Since this implementation does rasterization in software, it cannot achieve frame rates as high as we saw on the SGI. Nevertheless, the viewer is still adequate for navigating around the model, and of course it still refines to a high-quality version once the user stops moving the mouse. The process size for viewing this 4.5 million sample model was under 30 megabytes.
We present an extension to texture mapping that supports the representation of 3D surface detail and view motion parallax. This new approach, called relief texture mapping, results from the factorization of the 3D image warping equation of Macmillan and Bishop into a pre-warp, followed by standard texture mapping. This factored formulation has several advantages. First, the pre-warp equations have a very simple one-dimensional structure that makes them inexpensive to evaluate. Second, their 1D structure enables the pre-warp to be implemented using only 1D image operations along scan lines and columns. Third, the texture mapping hardware, already very common in graphics systems, efficiently implements the final stage of the warp. During the rendering of this car, red lines indicate the borders of the texture map polygons. The two images on the left show the pre-warp textures computed on the fly. In this example, a statue originally modeled with 35,280 polygons is being rendered by relief texture mapping no more than 2 polygons at any time. The result looks truly three-dimensional, despite the complexity of the original model. Accurate visibility is achieved by correcting depth values to match the perceived off-the-plane displacements. The image of the rat consists of a single relief texture mapped polygon. In this animation, conventional texture mapping was used to represent all elements in the scene. Notice the lack of view motion parallax. Trilinear filtering for texture minification was used for the facades and walls. In this animation, the near walls and all facades, as well as the car and the statue, are rendered using relief texture mapping. Notice the parallax effect and the striking perception of three-dimensionality obtained with a very low polygonal count. The facades and walls are modeled with a single relief texture each. The car and the statue were modeled using 6 relief textures. Note the awning sticking out of the wall of this house. Note that the car has a correct three-dimensional representation, not simply looking like a billboard. This animation was completely rendered using OpenGL and illustrates how relief texture mapping naturally integrates itself with popular graphics APIs. Note how this statue looks realistically three-dimensional. This effect cannot be achieved using just conventional texture mapping. The animation shown on the right was rendered using relief texture mapping with bilinear filtering, while conventional texture mapping with trilinear filtering was used to render the sequence on the left. Each facade and brick wall is represented by a single texture in both cases.
In this paper, we describe a system for real-time computation and shading of image-based visual holes for the purpose of virtualized reality. A scene is viewed by a number of reference cameras. In real time, our system allows the user to view the dynamic scene from any desired camera position. Previous such systems have attempted this using stereo vision, a slow and unreliable technique. Our system is based on the concept of the visual hull. In the paper, we describe an efficient image-based algorithm that allows us to render the visual hull in real time. This algorithm uses incremental computation and epipolar decomposition. In this example, the static office is a VRML model generated using a commercial software package, while the dynamic person is a rendered image-based visual hull. In our setup, we use 4 Sony digital cameras, each hooked up to its own PC. In real time, each PC computes a foreground-background extraction and passes this information to a server. As you can see, this phase could still use improvement. One can combine image-based visual hull rendering with traditional 3D graphics models. As one computes larger visual holes, the computational cost scales linearly with the number of pixels, and our frame rate decreases correspondingly. Here we show our system running from 6 ray-traced images as input. It shows the behavior of our system under perfect calibration and segmentation. All of these demos were shot in real time off of our system. Here are some more examples from our system.
These sessions were captured in real time from an SGI Onyx 2 Infinite Reality and are shown unedited. To emphasize the soft shadows, our first two examples are shaded without cosine falloff of light intensity. Here we see the scene without shadows. We use standard OpenGL as our base renderer. Now we turn on soft shadows. After a brief pause to pre-compute the attenuation maps, the shadows appear, and we can change the viewpoint interactively. To display soft shadows, we first render a shadowless image in hardware. We then add the shadows in software. The banding artifacts on the floor are due to fixed light source sampling. We now show a more complex example. In this position, the light creates self-shadowing on the leaves. During pre-computation, the scene is rendered from a number of different locations on the light. These images are then combined in software into a layered attenuation map. Our soft shadow renderings are very close to those produced by much more expensive methods, like ray tracing. The subtle soft shadows on the leaves are correctly rendered. An extreme close-up reveals a few undersampling and banding artifacts. Our final example is a dragon model. Unlike the previous two examples, this sequence uses a standard Lambertian shading model. The light is again positioned so that there are some self-shadowing interactions. Our algorithm accurately captures these interactions without difficulty. Note that no per-object textures are created by our method. Banding is more difficult to see here than in the previous examples. A closer examination reveals shadow bias artifacts near the rear foot of the dragon. In spite of the artifacts due to our interactive approach, the overall quality is very good for interactive applications, such as rapid previewing. In the paper, we describe a coherence-based ray tracing algorithm for efficiently rendering final, high-quality, artifact-free images.
Modeling with construction toys is a playful, tactile experience. To retain these qualities in a computer-based modeling system, we look to tangible interface technology. When a structure is created with our self-describing building blocks, its geometry is captured automatically. Inside each Lego-like block is a small yet powerful computer. Power and data pass between connected blocks over the jacks and plugs seen here. In these images, the correspondence between the 560 block physical model and the captured model is clear. Next, the same captured model is rendered with different appearance attributes to become a setting for a popular game, Quake 2. To create a geometry with more detail, we apply graphical interpretation methods to a model of a house. Instead of an unadorned rendering like this one, we use a rule-based system to identify and augment relevant architectural features. Additional geometry and surface detail is then added in appropriate places to create the interpreted rendering shown here. This model of the castle contains 118 blocks. Its interpreted rendering is done in a different style, more appropriate for a castle or a palace. New geometry includes a portcullis, window arches, turrets, and a flagpole. The existing geometry is interpreted as walls and rooftops. Appropriate surface detail is added throughout. This set of clay figures used in our experiment is representative of what a child might create. Our vision is to bring them to life. A 3D volumetric model of each clay figure is obtained using a system consisting of a digital camera and turntable. Here is an example of the image sequence. This is the volumetric model computed from the images. The clay model is classified by matching it against a set of deformable templates, and then choosing the template that becomes most similar in shape. Here the biped template is shown deforming to fit the clay figure. This example is a bug. Though it requires more deformation than the previous example, the insect template successfully assumes the shape of the bug model. This is a wolfhound. Here is a scan of the wolfhound. Our knowledge of the structure of the template allows us to identify the corresponding parts of the clay model and then bring the clay model to life.
Bye-bye now.
Represent models in configuration space. Each point in this configuration space corresponds to a shape on the right. The x and y coordinates of this control point correspond to the 2 dimensions of this blue plane. If we change many configuration variables at once, the entire curve moves. Most of the configuration space is filled with undesirable images, but a tiny part of the space contains images of interest. We seek to model this area of interest in a general way. The user can modify any of the parameterized characteristics of the scene. In this case, the style and color of the woman's bathing suit and hair. The author can even embed some surprises. Freedom is given to the end user, and yet the aesthetic sensibility of the author is maintained. Individual models can be composited into complex scenes as sprites. The individual elements can still be manipulated. Factor sharing allows for elements to be linked together, for example, the castle and its shadow. Multiple elements can be linked to give a scene a more cohesive feel. Here is how to create content using our technology. We will create a flower which can grow and wave left to right. First we draw one picture. This part of the process is similar to a conventional vector-based drawing tool. Everything is a spline. Using the spline tool, you can add spline control points. You can move them around or change their curvature. For this animation, a total of 4 examples is needed: a seed, a left, a middle, and a right. The flower is one completed example. Let's create the other 3. This is done graphically by cloning the original example and modifying it. The examples are linked together into zones. In this case, two simplices with a common edge. Arbitrarily complex structures can be created as needed. Edit the examples by scaling and rotating them. Choose as many control points as you would want to be tuggable. Tug the animation by simply clicking and dragging the mouse.
Vertical splines, quadratic Béziers in the case of TrueType, are used to describe the shape of the outlines. The font file stores the control polygons for these splines. An outline representation is used so that the font can easily be rendered at a variety of different sizes. In principle, the process of displaying a character on a raster grid is simple. The outlines are scaled to the desired size, then each pixel whose center falls within the outlines is turned on. At sufficiently large sizes, this approach is perfectly adequate. At smaller sizes, though, such as the sizes typically used for text, the pixels are larger relative to the character size, and the simple scale and fill method produces poor results. In the worst cases, filling the outline fails to preserve even the topology of the original outline, giving disconnected blobs of pixels as seen here. TrueType has a simple mechanism called dropout control, which can detect some cases like this. Dropout control turns on extra pixels to preserve the topology, but usually produces unattractive results. For the best results, the outlines must be hinted. This is a manual process in which a typographer augments the outlines of the glyph with instructions, or hints, for rasterizing the glyph at each specific size. These hints may have the effect of turning on some pixels which lie outside the outline, as well as turning off pixels which lie within it. The resulting pattern of pixels does not mathematically conform to the spline representation of the outline, but is intended to best preserve the spirit of the character shape, given the restrictions of the pixel grid. When drawn with smaller pixels, as shown here, it is clear that the hinted font produces the most faithful representation of the outline. A second aim of hinting is to produce consistency of features across different characters of a font. Notice how in this sans serif font all the vertical stems have the same weight. When the characters are rasterized, however, the varying placement of the stems relative to the pixel grid causes some stems to become 2 pixels wide, while others are only 1 pixel. This results in an uneven, blotchy appearance. If each character was corrected independently, the results would still look poor if, for instance, the stems of the U were each made 1 pixel wide, while the stems of the M were all made 2 pixels wide. A hinted font features global controls to ensure that features like this are consistent across characters. Here, all the stems are constrained to be 2 pixels wide. While this means that some pixels outside the character outlines are turned on, the resulting evenness is more important for preserving the visual character of the glyphs. Now let's examine the mechanism for hinting in TrueType. Here we have a character for which naive rasterization produces poor results. The hints for a TrueType glyph take the form of a small program, written in an assembly-style TrueType-specific language. The instruction set of this language contains commands for shifting control points around with respect to the pixel grid. Every TrueType rasterizer contains a stack-based bytecode interpreter for this language. When the font is rendered at a given size, the glyph's program is executed to adapt its outline to the grid. The result is a distorted outline, which doesn't look very good by itself, but gives the desired pattern of pixels when rasterized by the naive algorithm. Comparison of the rasterized characters, both before and after the hints are applied, shows that the hinting produces a better-looking pixel pattern. The Visual TrueType tool introduced at RIDT98 allows hints to be specified at a higher level. Instead of writing programs to shift points around, typographers specify hints as constraints on the placement of and distances between control points. These constraints are written in a high-level language called VTT Talk, or can be specified interactively with the graphical tool. The VTT package compiles these constraints to produce native TrueType assembler code. Here we have the lowercase a of the font Frutiger. We could try to analyze the shape of the character and determine what hints are appropriate for it, but we propose a simpler alternative. Let's look at another font, Trebuchet, for which we already have hints. These characters are quite similar in shape, and so it is reasonable to expect that the hinting strategies for the two characters should be similar as well. Our system adds hints to a font by copying them from another already hinted font. For the details of how this is done, we refer you to the paper. Here we show visualizations of hints transferred using our system from Georgia Roman to several other serif fonts. The resulting hinted fonts aren't perfect, but we believe they provide a useful starting point for a human typographer. Since the hints are transferred in a high-level form, it is straightforward to edit them using existing tools. We believe a system like this can be used to increase the productivity of professional typographers and increase the availability of high-quality digital fonts.
Large collections of texture images are provided in most image manipulation and 3D animation packages. However, using these images to texture an arbitrary shape proves to be a difficult problem. There has been considerable research on mapping images onto surfaces while minimizing distortion. However, fully covering the surface requires introducing seams between multiple images. Another challenge is to give the user control over the local orientation and scale of the texture. In this work, we propose to create a texture on an arbitrary surface by repeatedly pasting features of the texture onto the surface. We begin by identifying interesting texture patches from an example texture. This is done manually using an off-the-shelf image editing package. The goal is to align the texture patch boundary with natural features in the underlying texture. We envision that this process could be automated using snakes or intelligent scissors. Each texture patch is a polygonal image region together with an alpha mask that falls off near the image boundary. Surprisingly, we've found that a generic outline works for many textures. The orientation and scale of the resulting texture is specified by defining a tangential vector field over the surface. A simple choice for this vector field is to project the global up direction onto the surface and then normalize the resulting tangent vector. More often, the user will want to specify this vector field manually. Our approach is to specify the vectors at a small subset of the faces and then to interpolate the remaining vectors using radial basis functions. The basic step in our scheme is to paste a texture patch onto a random location on the surface. We select a seed face that is not fully textured, and from it, grow a surface patch in a greedy fashion until its predicted extent in texture space encloses the texture patch. This growth is stopped if distortion becomes excessive. Next, we optimize the parameterizations of the vertices such that both the orientation and scale of the texture match the vector field defined locally on the surface. The process is repeated until the surface is fully textured. Lap textures can be stored in one of two ways. The first approach is to save the parameterizations of the surface patches and perform the texture pasting at runtime. This requires very little texture memory since we reuse the same set of texture patches in all the pasting operations. Also, it produces very high-quality rendering since the textures are only sampled once. Runtime pasting involves ordinary rasterization operations, so it can be done in real time even on an inexpensive PC graphics card. The second approach is to construct an atlas over the surface which maps all the surface regions into a unit square domain. For this purpose, we use the same distortion optimization shown earlier. Each pasting operation can then write directly into this atlas during texture synthesis, and the resulting surface is rendered as an ordinary textured mesh. This has the advantage of producing a more traditional mesh representation which renders slightly faster. However, there is a degradation in quality due to resampling. This example shows the flexibility of the vector field control. First, the vector field is specified with the global up direction. Now the vector field direction is adjusted. Finally, the vector field scaling is adjusted. Here we show that even when the dinosaur tail is animated, the texture behaves reasonably. We believe our scheme to be highly practical. Here it is demonstrated with a variety of surface meshes and example textures. For fine-grained textures, we can use a single texture patch of a canonical shape, such as an irregular blob. Then, for a given mesh, we can reuse the pre-computed patch parameterizations and instantaneously switch between textures at runtime. This concludes our video.
Although still photographs can be both beautiful and expressive, they can do no more than suggest the dynamic nature of a scene. Video clips are much better at conveying this information. Unfortunately, they have the annoying habit of starting over with an unpleasant temporal discontinuity, or jump. In this paper, we demonstrate how regular video clips can be turned into infinitely long video textures that play continuously for as long as you like. To create a video texture, we begin by analyzing the video to find similar pairs of frames using an L2 distance metric. We then sequence the video by randomly transitioning between similar-looking frames. The red bar shows the frame that is currently being played. Red arcs show possible transitions to other parts of the video. The arcs light up when the transition is taken. Of course, we don't have to analyze the whole image as one unit. Here, we split the original video into two halves, find the best loop for each half separately, and then put them back together. This gives us more variety for a smaller amount of training data. We can also use motion estimation techniques to automatically break the image up into regions that can be independently analyzed and synthesized. Here, 5 different regions, shown in different colors, were automatically chosen for video texture analysis. In some sequences, there are no smooth transitions available, like in this waterfall video. In this case, we can sometimes obtain a plausible video texture by making frequent transitions and blending several portions of the sequence together. Here we show a video texture of a woman smiling. We use morphing instead of simple blending to reduce visible discontinuities at the transitions. This kind of a video texture would make a good replacement for the still images often found on people's web pages. We can also combine video-based rendering with traditional image-based rendering techniques such as view interpolation. Here, we have extracted a depth map from multiple video cameras and texture mapped the synthetic video texture onto this 3D surface. Such 3D synthetic elements could potentially be used in 3D computer graphics animations. Another thing we can do is to give the user interactive control over the video texture. For example, the user can specify with a slider which portion of the original video clip to use in creating the new animation. In the original video, the runner started at a slow speed and gradually began to run faster and faster. By moving the slider, the user can interactively specify a slow run, shown on the left, a fast run, shown on the right, or variations in between, as shown in the middle. We can use a similar technique to shorten or lengthen a sequence of video without changing the apparent speed. The original 15-second video clip is shown in the middle. The middle part of this video contains a good video texture, which we can shorten or lengthen to produce shorter or extended versions of the video. Sometimes it makes more sense to isolate the object of interest from the background and to track its motion across the screen. We call these objects video sprites. Here, we are synthesizing both the appearance of the fish and its trajectory based on the input video. We can also have the fish swim towards the red dot, which is being interactively controlled with a mouse, to better script its desired motion. Let's composite a final video texture by putting together all of our previous ideas. We start with a static fish tank background and add the bubbles on the left and right and 2 swaying plants. We can then add several instances of our fish video sprites to create an artificial fish tank. We can also have the fish follow a specified path. This type of scripting could be used to create a video-based animation.
Shadows and highlights provide important visual cues for depth, shape, contact, movement, and lighting. Without shadows, an animated figure may appear to float above the background art. Without highlights, the character may appear flat. In the conventional animation process, shadows are drawn by hand, a very laborious task. We've devised a system to automate this process. Our system works as follows. We start with a background painting for the scene. First, the user specifies the camera parameters by tracing 2 parallel lines in the ground plane. Here we see the resulting camera and the ground plane. Next, let's return to the image plane. Based on the hand-drawn line art of the bouncing ball, we extrude a 3D figure that matches the line art at its silhouettes. We build a separate figure for each frame. Since the drawings do not specify any depth information for the character, the user specifies a contact point where the ball touches the ground. For the bouncing ball, it would not be appropriate to use the same depth for all frames, so the user specifies a second contact point in another frame. Now we can interpolate or extrapolate the rest of the depths. Notice as the balls move away from the camera, they enlarge to maintain their screen space silhouettes. Now that we have the 3D geometry for the scene, we're ready to render the shadows and highlights using conventional 3D computer graphics algorithms. Here are the shadow mats for the ball in one frame. The highlight mat differentiates light and dark areas for the ball, while the cast shadow darkens an area on the ground. And here's the final animation with shadows and highlights. Now let's examine a more complex character built up from multiple layers. Once we've constructed the scene, we can easily change the direction of the light. Notice that when the man's arms and legs are built in separate layers, the shadow reveals gaps not apparent in the line art. Also, it's easy to switch from a directional light to a point light. Finally, we can even use a gobo between the light and the character to give the illusion of very complex lighting. This is the shadow of a gazebo above the character. Imagine drawing that shadow by hand. Now we add a hand-drawn background. Notice that there is an implicit backlight in the drawing. However, we still have the flexibility to vary the light position within a range that is consistent with the lighting direction intended by the artist. Next, let's see how this works with an animated figure. Notice that the man casts a plausible shadow on the floor and wall of the museum as he stomps along. Also, the highlights in his body are consistent with this dramatic lighting effect. Now we'll build a more complex background starting with this scene. We build the ground plane as before. All other background elements are drawn in relation to the ground. Next, we build up a wall by specifying contact points with the ground plane. Similarly, we build up boxy objects by specifying the points of contact with the ground plane, and then building up a series of polygons, each perpendicular to the preceding one. Using the same extrusion process we applied to the animated characters, we can build up other freeform objects such as this statue. The resulting set provides depth information while conforming to the hand-drawn artwork. Even though the scene looks distorted from the side view, when we return to the point of view of the camera, shadows in the scene appear plausible. Thus, in our final animation, the shadows of the stomping man conform to the objects in the background, and the highlight conforms to his body. This concludes our video.
This video presents a system for real-time artistic rendering of virtual environments. Our goal is to create an interactive walkthrough system that simulates the experience of moving through a virtual environment, but with an artistic feel. To achieve this goal, we need interactivity, frame-to-frame coherence, controlled stroke density, and aesthetic flexibility. Simply applying an NPR filter to the frames after they've been generated, even if one could do this in real time, yields noisy, flickering results without making the scene look artistic. Instead, our technique combines image-based rendering and non-photorealistic rendering to create artistic textures that can be applied with frame-to-frame coherence during real-time walkthroughs. Our process is as follows. We start with a coarse 3D model, and then we take photographs of either a real or synthetic environment. Then we map the photographs one at a time as textures onto the surfaces of the coarse 3D model. Let's zoom in and see what the textures look like inside the environment. After we map enough photographs to cover the model, we process the textures on the walls to give them a non-photorealistic look. Finally, we add wavy lines to mask the hard edges between polygons. And then we're ready to move around the model in real time. In order to create this walkthrough, we have to address two issues: eliminating potential seams between adjacent polygons, and controlling the size and shape of artistic strokes present in the textures. First, consider the problem with seams. If we run an NPR filter for the texture of adjacent polygons separately, we get visible seams in the final walkthrough. So we combine textures for coplanar polygons to generate a single seamless texture for each surface. Second, consider the problem of faithfully reproducing the strokes in artistic images as they are reprojected as textures. As we see in this simple example, naive texture mapping doesn't maintain the size of strokes as we move closer and further away from a surface. As we move far away from the back wall, normal texture mapping begins to choose mip-map levels in which artistic strokes have been blurred to the point where they disappear. We call our solution to this problem art maps. We explicitly create a mip-map hierarchy where every level is filtered independently, adding strokes of the same size to all images in the hierarchy, even though the images get smaller and smaller. Thus, when these art maps are displayed with conventional texture mapping hardware at runtime, The stroke size remains relatively constant regardless of how far we are from the polygon. We have also investigated a generalization of normal bitmaps in order to control stroke shapes as well. At very oblique angles, bitmap textures appear stretched non-uniformly, forcing the hardware to choose between aliasing and blurring. To control the size and shape of strokes in the face of such severe oblique angles, we can generalize conventional trilinear bitmaps by extending the traditional bitmap hierarchy with a cascading series of anisotropically scaled textures as shown here. The appropriate anisotropically scaled texture can be selected at runtime based on viewing angle. In this demonstration, notice that the stroke shape is relatively uniform across the image. While this approach produces better results, we find that art maps alone are sufficient, and they require less processing and texture memory. In sum, our project creates interactive walkthroughs of virtual environments rendered in artistic styles. The specific contributions of our work include methods for avoiding seams and controlling stroke size and shape. The advantages of our image-based approach are that it provides frame-to-frame coherence and interactive frame rates in visually complex scenes, as the expensive operations such as image registration, hole filling, and NPR rendering are executed offline during pre-processing steps. Finally, it is also very flexible, supporting a variety of NPR styles.
In this video, we show how inverse global illumination was used to recover the reflectance properties of a small conference room in the UC Berkeley Computer Science Building. 130 images were acquired from 40 different viewpoints. Multiple exposures were taken at each viewpoint to assure the full dynamic range was captured. A few of the images were used only for modeling the geometry and light source parameters. The 40 resulting radiance maps were used as the input to the inverse global illumination algorithm. The geometry and camera positions were recovered interactively using the facade photogrammetric modeling system. For each surface in the scene, the inverse global illumination algorithm recovers a single set of specular reflectance parameters and a spatially varying diffuse albedo map. Here we see the recovered diffuse albedo maps of 3 identical posters that were placed in different areas of the room. Although the posters were lit and photographed differently, the recovered albedo maps are almost identical. Recovering the reflectance property of a surface requires an accurate estimation of the incoming radiance distribution. Here we see a visualization of a hierarchical triangle mesh used to efficiently compute incoming radiance. The outgoing diffuse radiance values seen here are initialized in an image-based manner from the radiance images. Here we see a visualization of the recovered diffuse albedo maps. Here we see the room synthetically re-rendered under lighting conditions as close as possible to those under which the original radiance images were captured. The recovery of reflectance properties allows for moving specular highlights. Here we see the room synthetically re-rendered under novel lighting. Note the rough specular reflection of the room visible in the whiteboard. Here we see the room synthetically re-rendered with added synthetic objects. The objects fade in and out during the sequence to show added mutual illumination effects.
The first application is entitled Illuminating Light and is intended for a partly specialized audience. The application is an optical prototyping workbench that supplies experimenters with simple models of standard laboratory optics, including mirrors, lenses, a laser, beam splitters, film on which a recording can be made, and an object to be holographically recorded. These models act to recapitulate their real-world functions so that a laser placed in the workspace emits a beam of light that seems to advance from its aperture. A beam splitter placed into this path breaks the beam in two. A lens spreads the beam into many, and so on. Ancillary information is easily inserted into the workspace so that, for example, the length of each beam segment is displayed in its vicinity, and the angle of beam reflection is shown at each mirror surface. Illuminating Light also contains domain knowledge about holography. When the experimenter has assembled a proper hologram recording geometry, the system shows a rendered simulation of what a real hologram recorded in the laboratory with a corresponding setup would look like. The simulation is correctly reactive in the sense that changing the distance between recording subject and film results in the appropriate size change, and rotating the subject with respect to the film plane produces the expected change of vantage point. The chess and bottle system was an early design exploration that occupied an entire wall in a small office. We were experimenting with the idea of digital storage in physical containers, so here you see various bits and pieces of information attached to a glass vase. There's text, images, numbers, even live video. Here, the small video window we'll see in a second shows an experimenter putting the umlaut on the German word for cheese. Now in this state, the fragments are loosely associated with the vase. Springs attach them, but a simple gesture, rotation of the vase, causes it to pull everything fully inside itself. When the vase is moved to a new location, the same contents are of course still within, just as with a real-world container, and a second rotation causes them to be disgorged. At the same time any of this is going on, a chessboard can be brought into the space. Animated chess pieces immediately take their proper positions. In fact, they can't be fooled. But we'll have to wait for another day to play chess. A slight elaboration of the first part of the system shows a paddle-like implement being used to create individual documents, live video windows again in this case. The paddle is also used to move these documents around the space and to bring them into association with a similar vase. Again, a particular gesture triggers the container's ingestion of its captured information. The documents have been invested with a few ersatz physical properties so that, for example, colliding one with another transfers a bit of cartoon momentum, and naturally, unwanted documents can always be disposed of in a trash can. SEEP is a rudimentary hydrodynamic simulation, but differs from the previous two examples in that it does not have a priori knowledge of the objects that will be brought into its workspace. So here you can see us cutting out a rather uninspired airfoil shape. Placed into the laminar field of the SEEP simulation, the shape immediately diverts flow around it in accordance with the underlying Navier-Stokes formulation. A variety of cellular automaton called an FHP lattice gas is the engine responsible for the real-time flow calculations. An experimenter can, of course, continuously alter the position, orientation, and number of obstacles, and, naturally, these obstacles do not have to be inert. Here we constrain flow between the black cutout and an anonymous arm. Beyond just hydrodynamics, luminous room simulations can provide engaging teaching and illustration environments for a wide variety of processes, physical and otherwise. ERP is our most complex, comprehensive application to date, and is again intended for professional use, this time in the field of architecture and urban planning. ERP employs wireframe architectural models as the focus of a number of integrated simulations, including the generation of accurate shadows. These projective shadows are carefully aligned with and permanently affixed to the base of each architectural structure. A kind of inverse clock can be placed arbitrarily within the workspace and adjusted to control the simulation's current diurnal time, in turn controlling the sun's position in the sky. Here, our west-pointing 8 o'clock shadows shrink markedly at noon, and eventually swing around to the east as the time approaches sunset. This facility can be applied to shadow studies. In this case, an architect or urban planner responsible for the new structure on the right must worry that it may occlude the existing left building's morning sunlight, which indeed it does in this position. But experimenting with possible solutions simply means grabbing a building and trying out a new location or orientation. A 4-lane roadway with simulated Boston traffic provides the context for the next function. A material wand can be used to change the surface of any building from brick to glass, after which the building produces not only shadows but also solar reflections, accurate for any particular time and structure orientation. These simulated reflections, whose behavior is generally quite unintuitive, can aid the urban designer in checking for hazardous situations in which low-angle, late afternoon or early morning sunlight is reflected directly into oncoming motorists' eyes. But subtle changes in building orientation can often make the difference between an unacceptable design and a safe one. A measuring tool is used to connect together structures, a building and a freeway or 2 buildings, so that the closest distance between them is constantly displayed as it evolves. This information may also trigger alarm conditions when the ERP simulation has specific knowledge about, for example, local zoning regulations that prohibit the construction of a building closer than a certain distance to high-speed traffic. Finally, a wind tool can be placed into the workspace to engage the same FHP lattice gas technique used in the SEEP application. Here, the tool allows the ERP experimenter to investigate the effects of various urban arrangements on wind flow. Any buildings located in the flow's path give rise to more complicated and more locally variable airflow patterns. ERP's rendered air vector field provides a good qualitative impression of these overall patterns, but an anemometer-like probe tool can also be used to query the instantaneous wind speed at any particular location. The probe's numbers eventually float off to show the path that airborne dust or leaves would follow. Rotating the original wind-generating tool changes the direction from which the flow originates. Here we'll get wind from the northeast. Our final application is a distributed version of the initial illuminating light system, and is the first step toward building an entire luminous room, in which every room surface is capable of display and interaction. Here, a laser model is pointed so that its beam shines off the workspace surface, but a second surface picks up the beam, giving rise to an expanded available workspace. As you can see, our intrepid optical engineers are collaborating to build a much larger hologram recording setup. Now, ordinarily, we'd directly abut the 2 workspaces to simply produce a single larger environment. But for the purposes of demonstration, this disjoint approach, with the tables separated, is a bit more dramatic and illustrative. When the recording setup is complete, the familiar simulation rendering appears and is separately presented to each experimenter.